Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for June 2nd, 2015. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we're joined by Matt Kaiser. Welcome, Matt.
How's it going, Brian?
Great, thanks. Manny Ortiz.
Hey.
Welcome, Matt. Manny. I keep calling you Matt because I've got it backwards on the list here. And then
What's my name?
John Hogoboom.
That's right.
Welcome, John. Okay, I'm Brian Rexroad. Let's get right into it. And first thing, Hola VPN, this story just keeps building on itself. So, Matt, what can you tell us?
Yeah, this one just keeps getting more and more interesting. So there's a VPN service called Hola VPN, and apparently it has about 8 million users. And it seems that some people were calling them out on certain practices and certain vulnerabilities in the software.
So before we get too far, what's the purpose of the VPN service? You know, I tend to think of VPN as, you know, to be able to access the enterprise, but, you know, from a remote place. But what's the point here?
Well, a lot of people use VPN for two main purposes. One is to protect and add another layer of encryption around their traffic. So in case anybody is snooping, say at a public Wi-Fi access point or somewhere along that path between where you are and who you're talking to, they won't be able to see the contents of it. And that's what most corporations use it for, is to protect their customer traffic.
Absolutely.
And to limit access. Some people will also use it to allow themselves to come out from another part of the world. So for example, if you want to watch British television, but there's some sort of region prevention on that, if you come out from an access point, egress point in the UK, you appear to be a UK user, and you can access those services that way as well.
So, legitimate purpose, protect yourself, particularly on a public Wi-Fi. Perhaps not so legitimate purpose to be able to make it look like you're in a place that you're not. Okay.
So
Continue.
Hola VPN turns out is a peer-to-peer VPN service, which means that if you are a user of the service and you install the software, you also become an exit point for the service. So there's certain things about that are the software problems that people are complaining about. A few of these things include that the software itself is exposing certain identifiers for the users. So people use VPN for a certain amount of anonymity as well. Turns out that in certain versions of the software, you could make a request to an Hola VPN user and get back their unique ID. So you would know who they were and be able to track them a little bit.
Right.
The software itself also contains several vulnerabilities, being able to access arbitrary files on the hard drive remotely, being able to run code on the machine remotely, and privilege escalation.
But these are vulnerabilities that were perhaps not intentional.
Perhaps not intentional.
Okay.
There are also some qualms that people have with the way that the VPN service was described in their terms of service as to whether it was really a VPN, like a peer-to-peer service where everything's being shared or not, whether or not it was clear that there's a paid tier that was actually still using everybody else's connection, so that you know, people were paying to still use your bandwidth effectively.
Right.
So there are problems with that. Recently, it looks like there's been a back and forth. Some of the claims are being disputed, some of them are not. I just announced a bug bounty program. They're going to try and get some of this cleaned up. But another firm called Vectra just released, and I only found out about this sitting on this couch right now, just released a report stating that there are certain aspects of the service, of the software, that seem more botnet-like, as if being a peer-to-peer structure was not botnet enough like for you.
Right.
There's some sort of console within the software that allows more access than a VPN system would typically offer to somebody. You know,
Okay.
some interesting functions.
So Matt, you said something earlier about installing a certificate.
Yeah, so apparently Hola also installs a code signing certificate to the Trusted Certificate Store, which is not something most software does. I mean, Hola does sign its own software, which is a good practice all around,
Right.
but adding another certificate to the store is a little bit sketchy. It means that anything else that they choose to sign will also be accepted. That's something typically developers don't do, or companies don't do.
Right. So that seems to be some strange behavior as well. Any other examples?
Of strange behavior?
Well, just
Well, there's a lot going on in this story.
Yeah.
One of the more interesting ones that I've found was that the paid service, which is called Luminati, was actually used at one point in a DDoS attack against 8chan, which is a site similar to 4chan, which is much more well known.
Right.
But some people in the press are saying that this was the DDoS botnet. Hola is a DDoS botnet. It's not necessarily that.
No.
It was used in the attack.
I mean, that's one of the risks that you deal with in any kind of network service is that the network, I mean, this being a VPN sort of an overlay on a network, there's a chance that somebody's going to use it to try to send traffic, right?
And I think that's part of the reason that people were concerned that the peer-to-peer behavior is there, which they weren't even aware of. I mean, it's one thing to use a VPN service and come out from a rented server somewhere in another country. It's entirely different to be signing yourself up unawares that someone else may be using your personal computer to commit crimes.
Well, and then on top of that, there probably are not protection mechanisms in place to prevent that sort of thing. That is, perhaps in a future iteration, those are the kinds of protections or checks that might be put into place to see if it's being abused in a strange way.
I suppose so.
I mean, that's part of what threat analytics is about, is identifying strange behaviors of activity. So very interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how this sort of plays out as things go forward, if they can restore their reputation as a legitimate piece of freeware. I mean, this is a free app. We've had a number of discussions before about, if it's free,
You're the product?
there is no free lunch, right? Ultimately, there needs to be some motivation on their part that's a business model, and I think they're trying to clear that up a little bit and hopefully focus it in. So we'll see how this plays out. All right, good. Manny, you're next here. I guess we're, we've been talking a lot about the internet of those insecure things that aren't well prepared to be on the internet. And
That's right. Yeah.
I think this is one of those abuses that can occur.
Yeah.
Tell us.
So it seems like this month is a bad month for routers, because a couple weeks ago I did the story on the Net USB, which was another vulnerability against home routers. So this is a new one. It's a Linux-based one. So it's actually called Moose. Another fancy name for it. But this is a statically linked ELF binary, which infects the router. But in this case, the purpose behind it is for basically facilitating social media fraud. So it looks like, from the guys who researched this, which was from ESET, found that a lot of what is actually happening on the back end is a lot of this social media fraud. So it's an interesting twist on a use for the taking over these routers. So.
Can you explain a little bit about the social media fraud? What's the motivation? What are they doing here?
Well, so what they're doing is they're actually using the theory behind it is that you've got these companies out there, and you've got companies, third-party companies, and you've got individuals and companies who are interested in, let's say, bolstering their stats or their standings or views on a video or likes. And an easy way to do that, obviously, is to circumvent the normal procedure, which is, to create actually good content and have people really, voting on stuff.
Right.
So instead of doing that, you pay a company that says, oh yeah, we can drive traffic to your whatever it is. And some of these companies don't realize that there are third-party companies of third-party companies that, in the back end, they end up using these methods here for basically, pushing false.
Right.
So
just to kind of drive, so there are a few, I guess, variations of click fraud that I think that exist here. There's advertising click fraud, where you're actually kind of driving visits to advertisements, and the advertisements are paid for by the number of clicks against them. There's also sort of the search engine click fraud, where you can drive search results up by lots of other people, basically fraudulently creating the appearance that those particular things had been searched for before. That more likely is somebody searching for a related term. That'd be, and this would be kind of a similar thing in social media. That is to drive the popularity up, perhaps, of businesses that are trying to use social media as an advertising venue.
Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely. So basically, The interesting thing about this one, so last week the vulnerability there was actual a vulnerability in the device itself. This one actually doesn't have an actual vulnerability. They're actually just going against poor credentials. So weak passwords. Default passwords. So things that are just left open. So there's no magic there on the back end of how they're actually doing this stuff. The magic happens once they found them, and there's plenty of them out there. Once they found them, then the magic happens on the back end. Then this malware is able to basically, once it's got a foothold on that router, it has a lot of capabilities of actually scanning out the rest of the network that it's on now to find other devices that it can actually infect. So that's what makes this one sort of interesting from the sense that it's actually not a vulnerability, that it's just out there, and you can take advantage of it.
Any thoughts on what folks should do?
Yeah, so there is a long, there's like a 45-page write-up on this particular malware that does go through, the intricate details of what it's actually doing, and it basically boils down to, and I don't know if they listed anything here about how to mitigate this, other than simply, the obvious one is obviously change your default passwords on your routers, right? I mean, you can't run them with default passwords or default login names. Changing those obviously will mitigate this one in the bud. I mean, so
well, it'll keep it from getting infected. But does a power reset?
Yeah, I was going to say, most of them, when you power cycle them, it wipes the memory and it reboots from firmware.
So arguably, you should just make that a part of your normal routine.
Change your password, reboot it.
Yep.
Or reboot and change your password. One of the two.
I would say both, because if you can continually be reinfected by this thing, if it's fast enough, you can reboot it one day and have it done again by, lunchtime.
Right.
And you have to worry about it for another 12 hours.
Yeah, that's true.
And there are a lot of, don't assume that when you get one of these home routers from whatever store, you drop it on your network and it's got a password of admin to log into it, that's only exposed on your inside. Even if it is only exposed on the inside of your LAN, you should change the password anyway.
We had an example just a couple weeks ago that we talked about where the inside of the network was used to get to.
We did.
Yeah,
it was a Java-based thing.
It was actually an exploit kit, I think.
Exploit kit.
We're using JavaScript on the page to do the same kind of thing that Manny described, except from the inside.
Right.
And that password is different than your WEP or WPA password.
Right.
So make a clear distinction. It's not the same thing as the Wi-Fi password that you might use to connect to your router. It's an administrative password that's built into the device.
Well, what I thought you were going to say is when you buy something from the store, don't assume that it's up to date.
Well, that's true also. First thing you should do is patch it, but you're probably going to find that you're going to forget to patch and years will go by. And then when you go to check, you're like, oh, wow, they put a patch out 8 months ago or something.
Yeah. Or
that
3
I
or
never knew
4
about.
of them in that time. But I would say that I would highly recommend that you go out and read the actual research that was done behind this, because the 45-page article really goes into depth. So if you really want to learn exactly what this thing was doing, and there's a lot of interesting things that it was actually doing on the back end, to go ahead and read that.
I think, again, we were just talking about this a couple of weeks ago. I mean, this is a very common theme now, and it's interesting to see the level of sophistication, the level of called improvements from the attacker's point of view in these home router attacks. That is, a lot of the things that we had seen previously were very sort of haphazardy and sort of, I would describe them as somewhat experimental, really rudimentary, relatively speaking. Now it's getting pretty sophisticated. Things like obfuscation that we had encountered, some of the things where it's able to attack it from inside the local network, and some of the activities they're performing much more sophisticated than previously.
As a matter of fact, now you just reminded me, so this one actually does have the ability, once it gets onto the router, it has the ability to actually realize whether there's other malware families on the router itself and remove those.
And they do that, Yeah, and
So-
even very early versions of it, they'd set up the firewall so that it wouldn't accidentally reinfect itself or get infected by somebody else. But
right.
then when you reset it, all that stuff goes away. So, yeah, the story will continue, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So previously we were talking about VPNs that can help, protect your identity to some extent, but Tor is really designed all around that topic, right, John?
Yeah. So this is a VPN of another sort. And the first thing I want to talk about is how Tor works in general really quickly, because we've talked about Tor before. You kind of have somewhat of 3 layers of things. You have these entry guard nodes. So in my picture here, I have a client. He would talk to an entry guard node, and that's encrypted. And again, Tor is this software you can put on your PC or your Linux machine. It allows you to have these kind of encrypted tunneled connections through this anonymous network. So you go through an entry guard node, and then you'll kind of get pivoted around through a bunch of these middle relays, they call them, and ultimately you go out an exit relay and then go to the ultimate website. So your whole path, when the website that you ultimately end up at, they're going to look, to them it looks like you're coming from some other IP address that's really the IP of that exit relay node that you went to. So we talked maybe a few months ago or longer about an attack or a theoretical attack, whereas if you had enough control of exit relay nodes and of the entry ones, you could kind of do some statistical analysis to say, hey, I know who these people are because I saw him come in here and come out the other side, kind of thing. That's a rudimentary nutshell of the theoretical attack. The reality is there's so many of these nodes that it kind of gets tricky to actually be able to do that unless you're a large nation state who can really en masse really infiltrate a lot of these nodes into the network. And the Tor guys are looking to kind of control anybody from or prevent anybody from doing that. So the real hack here is in Tor hidden services. So this time, we're talking about not going to websites out on the internet using Tor. You're going to stay inside Tor. So I don't know if people are aware of something called the deep web or dark web, sometimes they call it. And it's basically websites that end in this .onion address. And these are hidden servers that are inside the Tor network. And if you're using Tor, you can talk to them. And there's all kinds of illicit things on these websites, drugs and weapons and all kinds of bad things. Facebook is actually available. Right, there are legitimate services also available via Tor, but there's a lot of illegitimate services available via Tor. And the server itself has anonymous protection inside Tor as well. So you can't, as an investigator, it would be very difficult to figure out who runs that server. Right. So it's both the client and server pieces are anonymized. So long story short of this is that some researchers have discovered when you want to run a Tor hidden service, basically there's an algorithm that they use to establish a set of 6, what are they called again?
Hidden service directory
Hidden
nodes?
service directory nodes, right. So it's a pre-computed kind of algorithm so that both the client and server will know what those are. What they figured out is there's a way that you can kind of like break the keys and figure out, well, I can kind of make myself kind of the one that he wants to be for the hidden service directory node. And if I get 6 of them, that's not really hard to do, or it's not that many that to have to do. I can now kind of get a sneak peek because I'll be the main gate. Anybody who wants to talk to this hidden service has to come to one of my 6 hidden service directory nodes that I'm now as an attacker kind of controlling. And in order to do that, it only took them 15 minutes per node to actually break the key on a MacBook Pro, which is not super high-powered machine necessarily. So to do 6 nodes, you could do it in a couple hours and get them injected into the network for the day and be able to control that. And you could probably do that day after day. So that's really the vulnerability here is that you can control that. You could also, there are other things besides being able to see who's trying to access these hidden services. You could denial of service them. That was always the one weakness that they were worried about there is that somebody would become the HS directory nodes for an entire service and then say, well, I don't know where it is, sorry. And now nobody can get to it, right?
Yeah.
Could you also impersonate if you controlled those 6?
Possibly. I'm not quite sure because there is some cryptographic public key, private key stuff that goes on there, so I'm not quite sure. I tried to get the facts, but not go into the detail of how the actual protocol works. But anyway, here's a kind of picture that shows how you would inject yourself in here and the red boxes around those HS directory nodes there. The basic concept here is that the hidden services face a greater risk of targeted de-anonymization because you only have to compromise 6 of them instead of having to compromise, lots on each side. That being said, you would still, even if you had control of those 6, you don't know who those people are necessarily that are asking you, because they're still kind of coming in through these entry guard nodes. So you would have to have something kind of on the outside or control lots of entry guard nodes, or be an ISP who could have a lot of visibility into people going to Tor, and then sync up that stuff statistically.
But it's still a lot less work than controlling both entry and exit.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's a lot less surface area that you have to cover in terms of being able to compromise it. So Tor project is working on a long-term fix. They realize that there are some issues with this. They've been working on a fix for it. In the short term, they've got a fix that they're going to put in that's going to make it so that you have to be up for a longer period of time before you could become an HS-DIR node. So that should help mitigate it, because more often than not, these attackers or people are going to kind of spin it up in a short term and try to take it over. So I don't know what the time is, but if it's even a week, then that would be a more reliable machine, you would think.
I think the old time was like 4 or 5 days before it would be accepted as an HS-DIR node if it wanted to be long.
So maybe it's, they're saying they're going to extend that out even longer. So.
Okay.
The other mitigation they said in the short term is, well, what you could do is you could use this, if you're a hidden services person and you're advertising your website or whatever that way, you could use this technique to kind of force your own, you could set up 6 nodes of your own and force them to be the hidden services directories for yourself. Anyway, interesting kind of analysis there. And again, people are always trying to find ways to de-anonymize Tor. And most of them require lots of computational resources. This one's probably of the easier side to do. But still, if you're really trying to de-anonymize, I still think you need to be able to have more visibility to the beginning part of the communication as well.
I mean, in the end, I think what you're really trying to do is get a large enough statistical population to help hide the identity of the user, fundamentally. And if you can break that statistical model, you've got an opportunity to learn more about who the users are. It seems like a lot of stories about Tor flaws and usage more recently. Perhaps it's maybe the usage is getting more significant. That is, there are more users, and then by the same token, I guess it is a academically interesting topic to study. So it used to be everybody was studying cryptography. You remember, everybody was trying to figure out how to crack DES and AES, and they were creating new algorithms. Schneider created Blowfish and some other things, and it seems like a lot of that has kind of shifted toward sort of networking and other topics, and also just finding vulnerabilities. Not too many people trying to fix things, but lots of people trying to break things.
Trying to break things. Yeah, that's true.
So it's actually I'm kind of going off on a tangential topic here, but I mean it would be encouraging to see more effort toward improvements rather than trying to break things in the academic space. But interesting article nevertheless. Thank you, John. So Matt, let's go back to you. And firmware is not always as firm as you'd like it to be.
Sometimes it's ridiculously infirm. I remember back when we covered some of the stories out of the Chaos Communication Congress late last year. Trammell Hudson had done some really interesting work on Mac EFI, Extensible Firmware Interface. And it's basically the secure firmware mechanism that's used on MacBooks. So someone, Pedro Villaca, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, just released some research saying that all the very hard work that was done previously, it turns out it wasn't strictly necessary because of a very silly flaw in the way that the firmware protection is done. Apparently, all you need to do to turn off the flag protecting the firmware from being accessible is to put your Mac to sleep and then bring it back up, and that flag is cleared. And that's mostly it. I mean, that's the scary part, is that it's pretty much that simple. You need a little bit of software. You need at least one kernel extension, and the paper that he put together explains the ones that are useful for this. But I mean, in terms of being able to do this, I mean, you can put your Mac to sleep remotely with a single command. So this is, whereas Trammell Hudson's attack required brief physical access to the machine to compromise the BIOS, the EFI, this requires no physical access to the machine as long as you can get root on the machine first. So
the consequence here could be that you could basically change the firmware, change the configuration, perhaps include some sort of a bootstrap or change to the
some kind of EFI level rootkit.
Yeah,
exactly.
Obviously not a good thing. So any discussion about the fix?
As of yet, there's no announced fix. Someone has suggested don't put your Mac to sleep. I mean, this is, again, a little bit silly considering that if you can do it remotely, the problem really becomes don't let your Mac get infected in any way. And certainly don't, whatever guards you can put in place to restrict compromise from becoming root level compromise, put those in place as well.
Right. Are there any, I mean, other than this sort of demonstration, were the details provided that would allow somebody to build an exploit around this relatively easily, or?
So as long as you can get the firmware out and bake your own, I think everything is pretty much provided for you. And if you can't find it in this document, I'm sure there's enough around it as well. Now this seems to be the year of Mac firmware problems. I'm going to count CCC for that. It was at the very end of last year. There's still work coming out at Black Hat. I think Zeno Kova and Corey Kallenberg are going to be releasing even more about Mac firmware.
Well, I think to the point of the discussion earlier, we talked about the cryptography and Tor and things like that. I think just the larger user base is making Mac a more attractive target.
Definitely.
I shouldn't say target, because I think the actual attacks against it aren't necessarily growing in leaps and bounds, but certainly from a research standpoint, it seems like there's a lot more effort.
To me, it feels like there was always this set of bugs out there. This was always a possibility. It's just no one has been playing in this space enough. And now it's finally happening, and all the things that we dreamed were probably possible are being shown to be true.
There are flaws in anything that humans create. That's a fact. All right.
But
well,
there's no exploits, no malware in the wild using this right now that's been announced, right?
No.
It's more kind of researchy. They discovered that this is a possibility.
Give it a week or a month.
Right.
Yeah, then go look on the Tor network. I'm sure you find something.
On the dark web.
That's right.
So we've talked a number of times about ransomware. I don't think in any of our stories in the past we've heard somebody apologize for their hacking activity.
Yeah, so this is this is a little bit different, I think. Obviously it starts off with your typical crypto locker type ransomware. When I think most of us are aware of what that is, and it's basically just once you're infected, your important files, and it's quite a long list of files that it'll actually go after, get encrypted, and then you're basically shown a ransom, and they're asking for a certain amount of money, usually somewhere around $500 US to get the key to unlock your files.
Which sometimes you get, sometimes you don't.
Right, but most of the time you do, because as the article actually says, the maker of the ransomware doesn't want the word to get out that he's not providing the keys, because that actually kills your whole entire business model. So, so usually if you do pay, you usually do get the key to unlock it. So,
brand reputation.
Right, exactly. That's exactly it.
Scary thought.
So, in this case, though, it was a little bit interesting. There's a couple of things that are interesting. In this case, the ransom was only, at the time, was only 0.1 bitcoins, which at the time came out to about $24 to get the key back, which is pretty low for ransomware. And then the most interesting part about this was that he came back. So this was actually released on the 25th, and so it said that this was actually in sleep mode. So a bunch of people got infected. It was in sleep mode on the 25th, on the midnight of the 25th. This thing awoke. A whole bunch of people got infected by this thing, and then the creator came out on Payspin and apologized and said, "Hey, look, I'm real sorry," right? And I think we have the message there from Payspin that he, I didn't mean to release this, and I'm going to go ahead and post the keys on I forget where it is, and I can't.
Mega.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mega.co.nz.
Yes.
Okay.
So he posted that. He posted the keys and said that he was really sorry. He didn't mean for this to be released. And the interesting thing is also that there was also a process built in that was going to automatically decrypt those files on June 2nd, today. So if you wanted to wait, you could actually wait until today, and it would automatically decrypt your files today. And hopefully that's happening. I haven't heard whether or not that's actually happening today. But that's one way of getting out of this thing without having to go out to try to get the keys yourself. But the person who was actually looking at this stuff was a little bit doubtful when they were looking at the actual malware, whether or not the claims that he didn't mean to release it were actually true, because there was a lot of thought that went into creating it, and I think that
creating it and distributing it.
Right. And so the reasoning behind why he decided to, at this point, come out and sort of give up the gig.
Not really clear. Huh?
Not really clear. I mean, there's speculation that that he got a little afraid that law enforcement was either on him or something to do with organized crime, because a lot of this ransomware actually is.
Yeah, that's a possibility, or perhaps he found a flaw of some sort that might provide some attribution and was just trying to cover it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So interesting, very interesting story there, and I suspect that issuing an apology probably rose the level of attention in a perhaps not necessarily desirable way. So in any case, I thought we'd talk a little bit about denial of service attacks. We talk about specific cases from time to time, but and in particular, Kaspersky came out with a report. They're doing basically a comparison of the fourth quarter 2014 denial of service attack activity that they're able to track, as well as and doing a comparison with the first quarter 2015 to see how things are changing. And generally speaking, what they were doing is saying that overall things are down a little bit, but they also have a qualifying statement that this is limited to attacks from botnets analyzed by Kaspersky. So there's a good possibility that the attack activity has actually gone up, but their ability or the botnets that they know about, or perhaps the methods that are used. So for example, later in the report, it talks about the types of attacks that they saw. I saw almost no reflective denial of service attacks included in it, relatively speaking. It was a lot of sort of SYN attacks and that sort of thing. So my suspicion is perhaps the types of attacks have shifted somewhat and perhaps not connected directly with the botnets they're using. That's just speculation on my part, but nevertheless, a interesting observation. We talk a lot about scanning activity and things in the weather report. A lot of that is actually attributable to China. There's obviously stuff coming from a lot of other countries as well. What we very rarely ever talk about is the fact that China is also a target of a lot of attacks. And that's very clear in this report. Basically, almost twice as many as denial of service attacks are targeting China in comparison to the United States. So very curious and interesting observation that I just wanted to share with you here. So China, US, second place, Canada in third place, with some growth in Canada comparatively speaking, and also some growth in Russia, which I think they said that were most of the targets, or the most significant targets, were some financial institutions in China. So perhaps some monetary motivation behind those attacks. So what I thought we would do next here is just talk a little bit about the defenses against denial of service attacks. And this actually comes from Charles Herring. He's a consulting security analyst at Landcoop. The recommendations he makes here, 5 defenses against denial of service attacks. First of them on the list, he talked about oversubscribing bandwidth. Now, I've actually talked with organizations, customers that have attempted to do this as a mitigation strategy. We're going to see a little bit later where I don't think that's a real practical thing to do. But oversubscribing is an important part. This is a quote from Charles himself. There's no such thing as a perfect defense against denial of service attacks. So what you need to do is expect that some of the attack may leak through. That is, even if you're using a mitigation provider to scrub out the attack activity, they may get 99% of it out. But if you're looking at attack that's many gigabytes or gigabits per second of traffic activity, you're going to need to be able to absorb a little bit. So the recommendation is don't establish your bandwidth based on say a 90% utilization on the network for a service that you have offered onto the internet. Second one, automated mitigation. We're going to take a look at an example a little bit later to help support this as well. That is, ultimately, you can't go in and look for the addresses they're doing attacks. It is typical that it will leave thousands of addresses, and to be able to try to transcribe and type in addresses into a blocking strategy and expect an access control list to be able to handle that is not a real practical approach to things. So automation is necessary as a part of this activity as well. And that's just one example. Sometimes you're not able to use addresses as a blocking strategy. Outsourcing to expert security firms. My interpretation is subscribe to a denial of service mitigation service provider. Ultimately that's going to help you quite a bit. Restricting access to UDP and TCP sources. I think ultimately, if you don't need the port to get to your application, block it. I mean, oftentimes, in fact, particularly associated with reflective attacks that we talk about frequently here, they're trying to toss UDP port 80 at applications that are really web servers, and that is TCP 80 or TCP 443. So it really does give you a leg up, and to work with your mitigation provider and say, you know what, these ports we don't need, block them right away, and then let's focus on figuring out how to block the bad sources associated with the actual attack activity, if that comes to be. And then system strengthening. I've seen a number of cases where attacks against organizations aren't necessarily trying to fill the bandwidth. They're just trying to, exploit the application itself. And what I mean by that, there's cases where if you have a search tool tends to be a very database intensive activity, trying to search for a term or something like that. That's a method that's used in denial of service attacks, a method that's used to basically try to throw search terms at a search tool that's on a website. So what you might want to do is, if you want to allow folks to do a search, maybe require them to authenticate, have a registered account, or do some sort of CAPTCHA or something like that to restrict it. So that's a couple of methods for system strengthening. So I think the basic concept here are those 5 defenses.
Yes, and I was going to mention in terms of system strengthening, another thing we've seen is if you have large PDF documents or other documents that are really large, sometimes attackers will just keep trying to fetch those, because that's going to create a lot of backhauled bandwidth that you're going to have to send back out again. So it's almost like you're impacting yourself.
So perhaps rate limiting on retrieval of particular documents, or perhaps make a frequency count like we do with password guessing. You only allow a few password guesses before you lock out that account. You might want to do that for a particular source. If they've downloaded it 10 times already, you'd think they got it already, right? So good point. Another good strategy for system strengthening. So anyway, to help reinforce this is a typical denial of service attack that was actually quite recent that we helped with a customer in mitigation. In this case is an example, just as I referred to earlier, where the predominant attack method here was a reflective denial of service attack, and they were directing, it probably came from port 1900 UDP, we'll talk about that in a moment here, and directed toward port 80 UDP. Well, and I don't know specifically in this case, but if that were a web server, it really doesn't need 80 UDP. And so that's one aspect of this. The other aspect here is in the profile, that this bottom graph is basically showing Oh, by the way, this attack peaked up around 17 gigabits per second. And so not too many organizations are buying, tens of gigabits of internet service. And so that's the reason that it makes sense to have a mitigation provider that has built out literally hundreds of gigabits of scrubbing capacity to be able to facilitate this. And you get to share that among the other subscribers. So it's a much less expensive alternative to trying to build that out yourself. Now, in terms of the distribution of the sources that we're seeing here, yeah, there are some sources that are really some big hitters here, but I wasn't able to really show it. But if you look over to the right here, this is just showing the first 1,000 sources. It turns out there are actually more than 5,000 sources that contribute to this attack. So you can, as I said earlier, if you're trying to transcribe IP addresses and put them in an access control list, it's not going to be a very practical thing to do, particularly if you're trying to mitigate the attack. This particular attack only continued for about 30 minutes.
But even knocking down the first 100 there would have had a
Knocking down the
significant
first, it would have
impact,
helped.
significant
Yeah,
decrease.
you're absolutely. It had a significant decrease in the size of the attack, so long as you had some oversubscribed capacity to be able to suck up the rest of it. So, good point. All right, so with that, I'll kind of segue into the Internet Weather Report here, and just resurging a little bit of activity here. This is bytes on source port 161 UDP. That's Simple Network Management Protocol. We're looking at the past 180 days of activity, and we are seeing still some what I describe as more frequent usage of SNMP as a reflective denial of service attack mechanism. In this case, we're seeing attacks that are up around 1.5 or so gigabits per second from time to time. Again, a sort of reinforcement. So just to put that into perspective with the sort of the collective reflective denial of service attack activity, this is showing the last year of activity. I think the good news here, and perhaps at least not inconsistent with the Kaspersky report, is it seems like the attack activity has kind of leveled off a little bit. It doesn't seem to be really growing at the same rate that we've been seeing over the previous year. So that's a positive thing, and hopefully that's the beginning of a trend in the downward direction. But we still see significant attacks here, a significant amount of activity, no gaps in the attack activity. There are attacks going on all the time. And oftentimes, and I think I've mentioned this many times before, it's actually video gamers that have extended the game outside of the video game itself and using basically a commercialized denial of service attack service to be able to do this, which is not a good thing to be doing. Moving on here, scan probes on port 135 TCP. We've been talking about this from time to time. There's still that scanning activity that's taking place on this port. Continues to be Chinese registered addresses from basically a U.S. provider that I think John you mentioned before basically has a not so good reputation.
Oh yes, now I remember. Yes.
On the, if you were to search for it, you'd find that there are a number of nefarious activities that are associated with that provider. We're looking at 100 days of activity, and actually, interestingly enough, the current activity that we're seeing is relatively low compared to what we've been seeing before, but still a significant amount of probing activity, 150 million probes per hour that we're seeing here. So I would say in a matter of hours, they would have the opportunity to scan the entire internet. So why that persists is a little bit beyond me. Here's an interesting one, scan probes on port 995 TCP. Now, I wasn't particularly familiar with this port, unless you're trying to set up your email access or something like that. But this happens to be POP3 over SSL or TLS. So basically encrypted POP3 service. And I think some ISPs support this. In fact, I think most ISPs support this mode of access nowadays. But they also sometimes support the sort of the legacy mode, which is I think port 110, I think is that right?
Yeah, probably 110.
One's IMAP and
I always get the IMAP and SMTP mixed up.
I may have gotten it mixed up as well, but nevertheless, this is probes from Netherlands. It may in fact be innocuous. It may be just looking to see which ISPs are supporting POP3 or something along those lines.
I was going to interject
Yeah,
that
go ahead,
there
John.
are some of these vulnerabilities like Poodle and Heartbleed, although Heartbleed's old, and what was the new one that came out?
Ghost.
Logjam. Ghost.
Ghost was not Ghost. Ghost
Logjam though, but
Logjam,
are vulnerable. I mean, this is SSL, so they're still using the same libraries on the back end there. So there is some potential that they might be scanning to see if there's vulnerable to those various types of new vulnerabilities that have been announced.
The other possibility is open email servers that allow you to send as anybody to anybody.
That's a possibility as well, which is one of those problems that you want to be mindful of. So, and nevertheless, there's a good possibility that this is innocuous activity that we're actually showing here, but nevertheless, you may see that, and if you have an issue with it, identify some of the message indicating that you're dissatisfied with the activity.
Hey, before you jump into this, I just wanted, we're talking about all the reflection activity. And one thing I wanted to kind of just briefly mention is people might wonder, the way reflection works is I'm over here on this network and I'm going to pretend that I'm some IP address. I'm going to spoof the source IP. I'm going to send it up to somebody who's going to reflect the traffic back to that fake source IP that's probably on a totally different network somewhere. And you would think, okay, as a service provider, why are you allowing people to spoof source IPs? Because you should be able to tell, hey, that's not one of my IPs. That IP is way over here on some other network.
Right.
And there is BCP 38, I think it
Right.
is.
Yep.
So if you are an ISP, you should probably, and you're not doing that spoof source ingress filtering that BCP 38 mentions, it's probably something to take a look into. Because that's the reason that all of this reflection activity can occur, is because ISPs allow it. And it kind of has to be done at a kind of closer to where your customer base is. If you're carrier, you can't do it up in the carrier cloud because you don't know where what came and whatnot from. But you got to
work with the routing protocols, right?
Right. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah,
people should think about that.
Good point, John. That extends out. It's beyond ISPs themselves. Any hosting provider where they're leasing out servers that might have become compromised, cloud service providers, same issue. If they're not doing spoof protection, it allows those cloud service, a compromised machine and a cloud service provider to spray out those requests out to a number of servers that are on the internet, and then have that reflected. Those responses go back to the target.
I wonder what it would take to have that put into the firmware of all the home routers that we keep seeing.
Good question.
So there's a significant number of home users, and if maybe an ISP is not willing to make that change for whatever reason, maybe at least enforcing it at the first hop away from that attacking home laptop, for example.
Good point, Matt. I had a list of things that every internet connected device should have as basic features. We're going to have to add another. So I think there were 5 items. We're going to make it 6,
all right,
or at least consider it. So interesting, good point. Okay, so looking at the top 10 most probed ports, at the top of the list here we have port 22 TCP. That's unchanged. What did change significantly is port 8080 TCP moved up 12 slots from last week. I don't have a real clear explanation for that, but we'll take a little bit of a closer look in a moment here. Port 23 TCP, that's Telnet. Manny, I've still got it right. Manny, you talked a little bit earlier about the password guessing. Oftentimes that's over port 23 getting to these home router devices. We talked about port 135 TCP already, and 445 is a steady participant on this list. 443 TCP followed by 80 TCP, looking for those web servers, likely ones that could be compromised, or on the dark web that are outside of Tor. There's the ones that aren't found by traditional search engines. 1900 UDP, that's oftentimes associated, or actually most frequently associated with the reflective denial of service attacks. That's simple service discovery protocol. And then at the bottom of the list here today is 3389 TCP, which is a remote desktop protocol, looking for opportunities to gain access into enterprises most likely. So in these probes on port 8080 TCP, 8080 is generally an alternative port for HTTP, or used oftentimes in the HTTP proxy. We're looking at 30 days of activity here. The primary sources in this case are in China, likely looking to identify anonymizing proxies or exploitable websites. So not a clear explanation for why there was a surge of activity in this particular case. It seems to be tapering off as we go here. Top 10 most sources doing the probing. There was one big move here. Port 0 UDP snuck onto the list, moving up 14 places from previously. Nevertheless, port 23 at the top of the list. That's these botnets of devices that are looking for other devices to build up on that botnet, followed by port 445 TCP. Steady on the list. Some of this peer-to-peer activity, we had talked about 17788. It appears to be a BitTorrent network to perhaps share some pirated video content, television programming. Port 0 UDP, generally in flow analysis, which this is all based on flow analysis, fragmented packets are going to show up as port 0 UDP. And that appears to be the cause of this in this circumstance, although when I was looking at it, it wasn't exactly clear what was going on in that case, so perhaps a little more analysis is warranted. And then port 80 TCP is showing up on the list.
I noticed in that denial of service attack that you had showed that there was some amount of 0 UDP fragmented activity in there.
Most
I don't
likely
know.
fragmented.
I doubt that accounted for this rise here because this seems pretty high up. So.
Yeah, this is, it's not a horrendous amount, but this was actually, in fact, I think I have a graph to show here. What do you know? I do. Otherwise port 0 UDP is reserved. So where it actually shows up on the network, it tends to be associated with fragmentation. Now, this is a case where we're looking at the number of sources that are doing that activity, and it appears as though they're doing scanning. So in the context of attack activity, particularly denial of service attack activity, the tendency would be to have some sort of an attack where it's attacking a lot of IP addresses, and that gives it an appearance of a lot of sources that are doing it. So again, it's relatively spiky activity that we're seeing here. We just happened to have picked up on that from some activity yesterday. So that's our show for today. I'd like to thank you for joining us, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at AT&T ThreatTraq@list.att.com. That's a change. It's AT&T ThreatTraq@list.att.com. So we look forward to hearing from you. If you have suggestions on the program or a question about something we said, please let us know. You can find AT&T ThreatTraq on the AT&T Tech channel. It's also available on YouTube as well as iTunes. You can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATT Security. So I'd like to thank you, Manny, for joining us today. You're a rare appearance, so
that's right.
We're going to have to get you here. Yeah, we'll have to get you here more often. Thank you, Matt.
Sure thing.
Thanks, John. I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode, and until then, keep your network safe.